From darkness into light. That's what we'll be celebrating less than a week from now, on May 1st. Well, I'll be celebrating. You can do whatever you want. At any rate, I can't talk about all the witchy and spiritual things without talking about the Wheel of the Year. Don't worry, though, you won't be finding yourself bombarded with festivals all the time. Hey, I'm April, and we are on a witchful journey. Before we get into this week's topics, I want to rewind the clock and go back to episode 2 for a second. Not because it has any relevance to today, but because I've been wanting to give you a quick update on what happened after that episode. I meant to update you sooner, but honestly, I kept forgetting. Now, you might remember the very end when I was almost rushing through the closing, and then came back on immediately afterward to explain why I may have sounded distracted. That weird beeping noise. After ending episode 2, I kept hearing that beeping noise. I followed it through the house and up the stairs into one of the bedrooms. I thought it might have been maybe the smoke alarm. You know, that beeping sound when the battery is almost out of juice? But it was coming from further into the room than that. I ended up following the sound to an alarm clock. It's not just an alarm clock. It has a setting for background noise, things like thunderstorms, campfire, static, bubbling brooks, and so on. And it has a small projector on the top that can display the time on either the ceiling or the wall. It also acts as a nightlight. The closer I walked toward the alarm clock, the more frenzied the beeps became, and the projector started to blink erratically. All of this while the actual digital clock face was blank. I didn't think anything of it as I picked up the clock. Just needs new batteries. No big deal. And it was still making noise and blinking while I inspected it for damage, because we do have kids. But when I flipped it over, it all stopped. I noticed that there was an aux cord plugged into the back and thought, oh yeah, why would I put batteries in this thing if I can just plug it into the wall? So I first tested the aux cord in case it was loose. Nope. Firm connection, no damage. I followed the cord to the end, which had been tucked behind a low bookcase, and there's an outlet back there, so I was prepared to feel some resistance as I gathered up the slack. Nope. Zero resistance. It hadn't been plugged in. I even double-checked by plugging it back in and doing exactly what I had just done by following the cord. That time I was met with resistance, so I flipped the clock over and removed the cover for the batteries with the intention of replacing them. And you've probably already guessed it. No batteries. No power source. So it seems that I stirred the pot a little bit by the end of episode 2. And no, I didn't get rid of the clock. However, I did cleanse it and the room, just in case. And I tossed the cord and put batteries in the thing. Don't worry, things have been normal since, but I did want to share that with you in case anyone was curious about what happened after I stopped recording that day. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, how about a tarot card? Today's card comes from the Tarot of Sacred Kingdoms deck. It's sold by Earth Moon Magic. The artistry is beautiful. Today we have the Six of Cups. This card is about innocence, nostalgia, fond memories, a longing for the simplicity of the past when things felt more carefree. Sometimes there are things from our childhood that we wish we could have appreciated more. We want to be able to bask in the joy of the simple things. So maybe it's time to bring out your inner child. Maybe it's time to revisit a hobby or an interest from your past. Maybe it's time to reconnect with family or loved ones. Sometimes there are old wounds that have continued to fester despite the passage of many, many years. Maybe it's time to notice whether or not you have anything that needs to be addressed or healed, and be honest with yourself. Maybe it's time to take a step back and look at your life in another light. This card could be showing up to remind us that we have plenty of things to be grateful for. And that's powerful fuel for moving forward. Now, I'm not going to pretend that every witch or every spiritual person adheres to the Wheel of the Year. Though if you're new to these topics, You've probably seen those words being thrown around and wondered if it's something that you need to follow. In a nutshell, you don't. You can if you'd like, but it's not a requirement. I'm also not going to pretend that there's only one version of the Wheel of the Year. That wouldn't be very nerdy witch of me. For now, we're going to focus primarily on the Wiccan Wheel of the Year. And the reason I want to focus on that first is because it's the most popularized version, and the one that you've probably heard the most about, especially if you're just beginning your journey. So the Wheel of the Year is a cyclical calendar of seasonal festivals that mark the year's chief solar events and the midpoints, or fire festivals, between them. The story is that Gerald Gardner, the man considered to have founded Wicca as a religion, and Ross Nichols, the founder of the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, sat down together to combine the solar events with the insular Celtic calendar, which is a lunar calendar, in order to create the Wiccan Wheel of the Year. The formal calendar itself is quite new, think 1950s and 60s, but is based on ancient folk traditions and practices. It exhibits quite a bit of Celtic influence, with hints of Norse and Germanic influence as well. There are 4 solar events, 2 solstices, and 2 equinoxes. The summer solstice, called Litha, is the longest day of the year. The winter solstice, called Yule, is the longest night of the year. The spring or vernal equinox, called Austera, is the midpoint between winter and summer when day and night are evenly split. And the autumnal equinox, called Mabon, is the midpoint between summer and winter, where day and night are, again, evenly split. In Wicca, these 4 solar events are referred to as the Lesser Sabbats. Side fact, it wasn't until 1974 that a Wiccan named Aidan Kelly gave the festivals Litha, Mabon, and Austera their names. The other 4 festivals are the fire festivals, sometimes referred to as cross-quarter days. These fire festivals are considered, in Wicca, to be the greater Sabbats. The fire festivals are Imbolc, around February 1st, Beltane, around May 1st, Lugnasa, or Lammas, around August 1st, and Samhain, around November 1st. Those dates for the festivals are for the Northern Hemisphere. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, it would be Imbolc, August 1st, Beltane, November 1st, Lugnasa or Lammas, February 1st, and Samhain, May 1st. The Wheel of the Year isn't just a party calendar, though. The festivals played an important role in agricultural practices in ancient times, marking the parts of the yearly cycle when certain things are done. The presence of the sun informed daily life, so following the cycles and seasons in ancient times would have meant life or death, especially in places that experienced colder climates. I'll go into more detail on that once we start talking about Beltane. The Wheel of the Year in Wicca also represents the duality and sacred union of the god and goddess in that particular religion. At the beginning of the year, the goddess is in her maiden phase, and the god begins to grow in power through the vernal equinox. At Beltane, they're old enough to court, and the goddess becomes pregnant. The god reaches his peak at the summer solstice, while the goddess is in her mother phase, and the god's power begins to wane at the fall equinox. The god passes away at Samhain, and at this point, the goddess is in her crone phase. And then at Yule, the goddess gives birth to the god, and her phases reset. She becomes the maiden again, and the god she birthed grows in power, and the cycle begins all over again. Just about every culture has their own version of the Wheel of the Year, and I will eventually get around to all of those that I can gather up. Don't worry. I do want to touch on a few different calendars, though, and share a couple of the narratives that accompany them. So the pre-Christian Celtic calendar appears to be a lunar solar ritual calendar. On display in the Lugdunum, formerly called the Gallo-Roman Museum of Lyon in France, we can see one such example in the Gaulish Coligny calendar, which is the oldest known Celtic calendar that still exists today. This one known existing calendar dates back to the 2nd century. However, scholars suspect the calendar itself is far older, quite possibly as old as 1200 to 550 BCE. This calendar lays out a 5-year cycle that reconciles the cycles of the moon and the sun. It's quite complicated with all of its notations and defines the dark half of the year arriving with Samhain and the light half of the year arriving with Beltane. Then we have North America, where we see remnants of the Native American medicine wheel, which can be seen in various locations across the US and Canada. They're stone structures that mostly appear to have been used to track the lunar cycle, as most of them have 28 spokes. This is one that we'll definitely revisit in another episode. I mostly wanted to mention it because of the wheel aspect, because like other cultures across the sea, they created stone circular structures that appear, at least in part, to be intended to track a certain length of time. Then there's the Scandinavian runic calendar, which, like the Caligny calendar, is a lunar solar calendar. The days were marked using horizontal lines of symbols, and solstices and equinoxes and other celebrations throughout the year were marked with additional lines of symbols. The ancient Slavic example of the Wheel of the Year has too many different names according to too many different sources, at least upon quick inspection, because I want to dig into that another time. But it appears to have been solar-based, with a week consisting of 9 days. It held symbolic meaning as well, representing the cycle of life and death and the spirit realm. The mythology connected to it is about an everlasting conflict between Perun, the god of thunder and lightning, and Vels, the black-horned god of the underworld who has the ability to shapeshift. Vels makes an annual ascent up the world tree as a serpent and steals Perun's divine cattle. Perun, realizing what happened, chases after Vels. Vels taunts Perun and flees, turning himself into various animals and hiding under and behind things like trees, bushes, and houses. Perun retaliates by throwing lightning bolts at Vels. It's said that any time a home, a tree, or a person is struck by lightning, it's the result of this conflict. Perun eventually defeats Vels and sends him back to the underworld. The storms cease and order is restored. On the new year, otherwise known as the Great Night, 2 of Perun's children are born: Eurylo, god of vegetation and fertility, and Morana, goddess of death, nature, and winter. Vels kidnaps Eurylo shortly after his birth and takes him to the realm of the dead to raise him as his own. Eventually, Eurylo makes the return trip back across the sea, bringing fertility and spring in his wake, what we would see as the spring equinox. Eurylo meets Morana and courts her. The summer solstice marks the union of Eurylo and Morana, and their union is to ensure a bountiful harvest. Perun and Vels call a truce, but Eurylo eventually betrays Morana in the autumn equinox, and Morana slays him, sending him back to the underworld. The storms begin again because the truce has been called off. And Morana grows old and passes away, only to be reborn at the start of the new year. Now, I've read a number of different versions on this, so this is just one version, and eventually we'll dig deeper, but I don't want to stray too far off topic today. The last bit of mythology in connection to Wheels of the Year that I want to share today comes from the modern Druidic mythology. This is one that a number of pagans recognize as well. And in this one, there are 2 main deities: the Holly King, ruler of the waning year, and the Oak King, ruler of the waxing year. Similar to Perun and Vels in Slavic mythology, the Holly and Oak Kings are in an endless battle. The Holly King defeats the Oak King at the summer solstice. The Oak King begins to regain his power at the autumn equinox, and at the winter solstice, the Oak King defeats the Holly King. At the spring equinox, the Holly King begins to regain his power, and the cycle starts all over again at the summer solstice. The 2 deities represent not just the light and dark of the seasons, but also the light and dark aspects of the male god, as 2 parts of a whole. This is another one that we'll talk about in more depth at another time. As we'll see over time, as in the more we hang out and I share the vast amounts of information that I've dug up in my research, the more we'll see that each version of the Wheel of the Year isn't just representative of the sun's cycle of death and rebirth, but also representative of the immeasurable series of cycles in both the micro and macrocosm of the universe. It's pretty cool. Now, let's get into the fire festival of Beltane. There's a lot. And because we're focusing on the Wiccan Wheel of the Year first, let's talk about what Beltane looks like within Wicca first. Side note, this festival has also been referred to as May Day, It appears that it may have adopted that name sometime in medieval or early modern Europe, and is widely associated now with plays, sex, flowers, and the crowning of a May Queen. You've probably heard it pronounced Beltane. In my studies, it seems like this is the most common pronunciation within the Wiccan religion. Side note, I'm not Wiccan, so I find that I bounce back and forth between Beltane and Beltane, depending on who I'm speaking with, and primarily go with the Beltane pronunciation. In Wicca, this is the festival that celebrates the merging of the masculine and feminine energies, more specifically, the divine coupling of the god and goddess. It marks the beginning of summer, and recognizes the power of life in full, the greening of the world, when everything flourishes. It's a time of year when the feeling of youthfulness abounds. The colors that are primarily associated with Beltane, at least within Wicca, are red, representing strength, sex, passion, vitality, and bonfires, and light green, representing the raw energy of nature, balance, wildness, and harmony. Let's not forget, though, that this fire festival has its roots in ancient Celtic traditions and practices. That's why I tend to lean more toward the Irish, Scottish, Gaelic pronunciations and spellings, Beltane and Bealtaine, respectively. I don't know if I fully pronounced the Scottish version correctly. I'm sure somebody might correct me at some point. Side note, Beltane is also the modern Irish word for the month of May. You see, in ancient times, everyone lived according to the seasons. Agriculturally speaking, Beltane, which falls on or around May 1st, which, remember, is the midpoint between spring equinox and summer solstice, signaled the start of the growing year, and marked when livestock would be moved from their sheltered winter grounds to the open summer pastures. I've seen a lot of mentions of sunset of April 30th to sunset of May 1st as the primary window of celebration. The first mention of Beltane in literature dates back around the 8th to 10th century medieval Ireland, in the Takmark Ymir, or in English, the Wooing of Emer. Now, the name Beltane translates to something like bright fire. That probably originally had something to do with the brightness and warmth of the sun getting stronger at that point in the year. But one of the many traditions that took place involved a rather large fire atop the hill of Ishnok. The hill of Ishnok is one of the most sacred and historic sites in Ireland, occupying what many call the center of the island. From this spot, more than 12 counties could be viewed at once, and it stood in the middle of the 5 provinces, and was the place where just about all of the national meetings took place. So, of course, it was the ideal spot for lighting the main Beltane bonfire. Everyone would extinguish all household hearth fires, and the fire atop the hill of Ishnok would be lit. As the fire became visible to all of the nearby hilltops, each hilltop site would light their own fire in turn, which would signal the lighting of the local bonfires. Whether by signal alone or part of the actual fire being carried to each local bonfire, I'll be honest, I don't know. But everyone would relight their household hearth fires using their local bonfire. These local bonfires would serve a second purpose as well. Generally, there were 2 bonfires, positioned fairly close together. People and livestock would pass between the 2 fires. The idea was to use the smoke, flames, and ashes from the bonfires to cleanse and protect. In a practical sense, the smoke and heat would have removed bugs from the livestock and probably also the people. But in a spiritual sense, smoke cleansing has always been believed to have protective, healing, and cleansing properties. It sounds like they passed their livestock between the bonfires in the process of bringing them to the summer pastures. I'm not 100% on that, but it would make sense in a way. Some sources say that the reason for this tradition had to do with Beltane being opposite Samhain, and because of that, it's a time when the veil between worlds became very thin, and creatures like the Fae or fairies would be more apt to cause mischief. Other sources say that the Fae didn't become associated with this festival until the 16th or 18th century. Either way, the bonfires and other Beltane traditions were meant for warding off spirits, calling in good fortune, encouraging fertility, and protecting land and livestock. One of the other traditions that some sources say is Scottish, while other sources say is Scotch-Irish, is the Beltane Bannock. It's a whole oat cake that is traditionally made and eaten on Beltane morning to ensure the health of crops and herds. There's a bit of simple folk magic that goes along with this baked good. Once made, the bannock gets separated into 9 knobs, and each knob is dedicated to something that preserves crops and livestock for the year, or wards off things that would otherwise do harm. To do this, the person would face the fire, ask for protection, and eat it while tossing a piece of the bread over their shoulder. They would say something to the effect of, "Here to thee, wolf, spare my sheep. There to thee, fox, spare my lambs. Here to thee, eagle, spare my goats. There to thee, raven, spare my kids. Here to thee, martin, spare my fowls. There to thee, harrier, spare my chickens." And also probably adding in requests for things like sufficient rain, lack of illness, and high enough livestock birth rate, or whatever, to use the remaining knobs of bannock. I did find a recipe for the bannock bread, which I will share, along with the rest of the recipes that I'll mention soon, and those will be in the show notes. I'll also be sharing them on my socials, along with whether or not I made them and how they turned out. Another tradition is to take part of the day to do what's called beating the bounds, in which you walk the perimeter of your property and repair fences and boundary markers as needed. This was done for 2 reasons. The first, practicality, because you wouldn't want livestock escaping through a damaged place in your fence or accidentally allowing a predator in. You also leave your scent behind, which helps deter unwanted animals. The second reason would be the more magical one. By walking the perimeter of your property, you're reinforcing that it is, in fact, your property. And by repairing fences and boundary markers, it's kind of a magical warding as well. Another one is washing your face in the morning dew. Both men and women participate in this, as it's supposed to cleanse you of the previous year's stress and ill luck, and bring you good health, no sunburns, and a fresh, good-looking face for the year. Glamour spell, anyone? Yet another tradition is to decorate a small tree, or find a tree branch and decorate that, with bright ribbons, flowers, and painted eggshells. Usually the tree would be the focal point in the village. If it's a branch, it gets left outside your home as a symbol of new beginnings and protection. When it comes to a decorated tree, it's customary for people to leave offerings or small tokens for blessings and prosperity. It sounds to me like these offerings were originally left for the fae or fairy folk to keep them from getting into mischief on your property, which is why you leave the offerings outside, because, as the Irish will tell you, never invite the fae into your home. We'll talk about that some other time. If you do plan on leaving offerings, I've heard that shiny things, milk, cream, and honey are good offerings to leave for them. Sometimes these decorated trees are referred to as May bushes by those who incorporate May Day celebrations into Beltane. Side note, the name May Day began being used in the 13th century and has to do with the Catholic Church and devotions to the Virgin Mary. May Day morphed into International Workers' Day in the late 19th century after a particularly violent confrontation took place in Chicago, Illinois in 1886. A lot of places include things like the maypole, which is usually a tall, wooden pole adorned with flowers and very long, colorful ribbons that hang down from it. The maypole dance is meant to encourage and celebrate fertility in nature, livestock, and humans. The ribbons are meant to be woven around the maypole by the dancers. The common number of ribbons is 24, but it really just depends on how many dancers there are. There should be a ribbon for each dancer. I've heard that at some point the god Bealtaine became associated with Beltane. Some sources say that he's possibly the namesake of the festival because Bealtaine is the pastoral deity associated with cattle and sheep, and also either the sun or fire god. I've read a lot of varying sources from he's the namesake to he was included over time, to he has nothing to do with Beltane. So I don't know for certain, but I figured I should at least mention him. It seems that there's this idea that Beltane is primarily a day of sex, where couples run off into the woods together and go at it. Or maybe even just have group sex rituals right at the bonfire. I'm not here to tell you that that's entirely false, but since Beltane does seem to be labeled as a festival that just gives people an excuse to go hog wild, I do want to talk about that. So, in terms of the mythology connected to Beltane, yes, it's celebrating, at least in Wicca, the union, the coming together of the horned god and the moon goddess, or triple goddess. Beltane is when the goddess becomes pregnant. We've already established that earlier. And I read a couple of sources that said that in ancient times, women would kind of try to time their pregnancies to begin at Beltane so that their third trimester came after the final harvest, when it was getting colder out. So they'd be able to spend more time indoors, cozied up near the fire, while they did indoor chores that allowed them to sit down and prop their feet up. Chores like mending clothing, simmering stews, baking, knitting new clothing or blankets, etc. Then, by the time the baby was born, there was only a few weeks left before the spring equinox, giving the new mother time to heal before needing to go out and gather fresh foods that would have been essential to nourishing her body so that her milk supply had the right nutrients for the baby. So again, yes, in a way, Beltane is kind of a sex day, but also not really. That's only a fraction of the whole. Again, it's a festival celebrating the return of the sun after a long winter. It's celebrating the renewal and waking up of the forests. It's the starting point of the crop growing season. So I tune in to a lot of YouTubers and other podcasters, and at least a few times I've heard, in a nutshell, "It's Beltane, the sexy holiday. We're supposed to have sex that day." And sorry guys, but I kind of disagree. It is a festival surrounding fertility, but I feel like that can be really misunderstood. It's a little more sacred than that, you know? And "we're supposed to have sex on that day" just gives me the creepy crawlies. It sounds super manipulative and a little bit predatory. Sorry, not sorry. Now, this is just speculation on my part, but so many of the sources that I've read talk about, and I shit you not when I quote, the importance of sex and sexuality in connection to Beltane, and how, again, I quote, "It's a day for dancing naked around the bonfire, participating in orgy paloozas, and experiencing pure ecstasy." Stop. While there may be some grains of truth there, let's stop and take into consideration that these quotes are mostly coming from people who either practice Wicca as a religion or adhere to a lot of Wiccan traditions, or in some cases are modern druids. And no hate on any of you, truly. Just hear me out. Let's put the brakes on and look at who founded Wicca as a religion. Gerald Gardner. Did you know that Gerald Gardner was a member of the New Forest Coven? Did you know that the New Forest Coven was a pagan witch coven within a nudist colony? What colony? The 4 Acres Nudist Club. Did you know that Gerald Gardner, in continuing his interest and enthusiasm in nudism, purchased a plot of land within 4 acres in 1945 and started the Bricket Wood Coven there, before becoming the founder of Wicca? Like I said, truly no hate. I just wanted to point that out because it seems glaringly obvious to me that he would incorporate nudism into his coven practices, since he himself joined a nudist coven. Can you see where I'm going with this? Anyway, that's at least an entire episode on its own. Let's talk about where some amazing Beltane festivals take place. So we have, in Ireland, obviously, the Hill of Ishnach in County Westmeath. This year, 2025, it's taking place on May 10th. There is also a megalithic site in County Donegal where stones have been placed in a circle in a way that aligns with the sunrise on Beltane. That site dates back to somewhere between 2100 to 700 BC. I feel like that would be so cool to stand there and watch the sunrise that day. And then in Scotland, we have Colton Hill in Edinburgh. That's the largest annual Beltane Fire Festival, and I've read that every year it's held on the night of April 30th. In England, there are various locations where celebrations are held, some of them being Butser Ancient Farm in Hampshire, the Obios Festival in Cornwall, and the Thornborough Hedges in North Yorkshire. Hopefully I pronounced all of those correctly. In the US, we have Hudson Valley Beltane Festival in New Paltz, New York, the Crabtree Farms Beltane Celebration in Chattanooga, Georgia, the Spirit Haven Ranch in North Carolina, and the Fertile Ground Gathering in Prince William Forest Park in Triangle, Virginia. Obviously, that's not an all-inclusive list. I'm sure I'd be talking forever if I tried to include every single one. And I'm sure if you were to do some digging on finding where in your area there's a festival, you'd probably be able to find one pretty quick. So let's talk about the really fun stuff now. I know you've been patiently waiting for recipes and all the info on how you can celebrate Beltane even without having livestock to worry about, or big open fields where you can have a couple of bonfires. Like we've already talked about, Beltane is a celebration of renewal, the return of the sun, fertility, and union. It's also a time of creativity and growth. Some of the following aren't things that have always been associated with Beltane, but over time have come to be associated due to our modern world and the many different ways that it's been celebrated over the course of time. Let's start with altars. If you choose to put together an altar and decorate it for Beltane, some ideas would be fresh flowers, salts for purification, fertility symbols, whether for you or your garden or just for the general season, fire symbols for welcoming the sun back, candles, honey and milk if you choose to do an outdoor altar and want to leave offerings for fairies, oats, antlers, and horns to honor the plants and animals, and arrows or swords as symbols for protection, intention, or connection to the spirit realm. Arrows have the energy of air, swords have the energy of fire. In terms of rituals, they can either be simple or complicated. I'm a firm believer in doing whatever feels right and true versus performing the most complicated ritual you can find. But if that's the route you want to take, have at it. Some ideas would be rituals surrounding protection, prosperity, fertility, strengthening relationships, conversation, and divination. You can also bless your garden or even your houseplants with a protection or abundance spell if you'd like. Abundance spells for the wallet are also pretty common at this time. If you're the type to work with deities, popular ones that people work with or just leave offerings for are the May Queen, the Green Man, Flora, Belinus, Pan, Dionysus, however you pronounce his name, Aphrodite, and Venus. Obviously, do your homework on these deities first so you have an idea of what they like for offerings and how they like to be contacted, and if they're the one that you actually want to leave offerings for or to work with. I'm not going to give you a breakdown of each one in this episode because I feel like I would be doing a disservice by not giving each one enough time. I do plan on covering all of them though, but that's not going to be today. So let's say you want to set some candles out. What colors are generally associated with Beltane? Often blue, pink, red, green, gold, and yellow. That's not just limited to candles, though. You can use those colors for ribbons, painting eggshells, altar cloths, even the clothing that you choose to wear. If you want to incorporate animals into your practice, think along the lines of cows, sheep, horses, rabbits, butterflies, cats, and bees, and maybe even swans and doves. For botanical associations, you can include cinnamon, mint, yarrow, vanilla, lilac, elderflowers, marigold, rose, apple, birch, grapevine, holly, willow, jasmine, daffodil, honeysuckle, St. John's wort, fern, nettle, marjoram, mushroom, frankincense, and meadowsweet. Obviously, do your homework, because again, these are things that I will cover in great detail at another time, but there's too much to try to cram it all into one day. Are you a crystals person? I love me some crystals, even though originally none of them were associated with Beltane, but that doesn't mean they aren't useful. This is another do your homework on these, because I'd love to ramble on about crystals right now, but we'd be here forever. So, crystals that are useful for Beltane: carnelian, citrine, yellow jasper, black obsidian, emerald, rose quartz, moonstone, amber, and malachite. I feel like I should say right now that you absolutely do not have to create a shopping list and go out and purchase anything. If you'd like to, fine. If you already have some of these things because you've accumulated them over time, great. If you'd rather go out into nature and just collect some things that are local to your area, fantastic. You do you. If you are purchasing stuff, please, please, please make sure that you're purchasing from ethical sellers, because there is way too much trauma happening on this planet as it is. Okay, I'm getting off the soapbox. Foods. My personal favorite. What foods are commonly used during Beltane celebrations? We can go with oat cakes, like the Bannock bread, almond bread, a warm spiced drink like Caudle, red fruits like strawberries and cherries, grilled meats, milk, butter, cheese, and foraged greens and berries. Major note on the foraged greens and berries. If you do not know what it is, for the love of everything, do not eat it. The last thing that I want is for you to just go wandering into nature to forage and end up with some nightshade berries or some other plant life that has the ability to kill you. If you're going to forage, make sure that you are absolutely confident, or bring someone along that is absolutely confident, in plant identification. I say this with the book Into the Wild in mind. That guy went to Alaska with the intention of living off the land and ultimately died because he misidentified some berries, despite having a plant identification book with him. There are plants that look damn near identical, and oftentimes one is poisonous and one is not. So please be extremely careful if you plan to forage. Sorry, now I'm getting off the soapbox. So, I want to share some recipes with you, and I'll kind of just name them off, but I will leave links to them so you can check them out and see if there's something that you would want to use. Obviously, since I've mentioned it twice already, the Beltane Bannock oatcake will definitely be in there, as will Caudle, spiced egg custard, which I remember having as a kid, and it is delicious, chive butter, cinnamon butter, nutmeg milk, brown butter mixed berry crumble bars, which sound delicious, wild garlic potato soup, honey and lavender shortbread cookies, which I'm absolutely making, ginger and honey cake, and strawberry cupcakes with vanilla icing. I've read varied things on whether you should share any of these things with people outside of your household. Do what you want, but I have read that at least in Ireland, they don't share food on Beltane because that's basically giving away your abundance that you've asked for the year. Again, do what you want in your practice. I just thought I'd make a note of it. Oh, a couple of quick little things. Small ways to celebrate. Obviously, bonfires, collecting morning dew to wash your face in, making flower crowns, planting seeds, which I'm absolutely going to do, dancing, again, definitely going to do that, taking a nature walk, absolutely going to do that, a picnic, and of course, painting eggshells to hang from a branch or tree outside of your home are all wonderful ways to celebrate if you aren't in an area that does a larger festival, or if you're more of a solitary practitioner. I know for me, like I said, I plan on doing a handful of these things. Thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out with me today. Next time, we'll have another storytime episode in which we cover the Bell Witch. I hope you'll join me for that. If you enjoyed this episode and don't want to miss out on future episodes, hit those like and follow buttons. It's super helpful in letting me know what topics you guys find interesting. For now, you can find me on Facebook, Witchful Journey Podcast, on Instagram at _witchful_journey. For those of you that need a reminder, the underscores are the spaces with the little lines at the bottom. On BlueSky at awitchfuljourney.bsky.social, and on YouTube, A Witchful Journey. I enjoy hearing from listeners, so if you pop in on my socials, say hi. You can also email me at awitchfuljourney@gmail.com. I'm April, and we are on a witchful journey.